Ryan Carter sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey. The dim lighting and stale air of the establishment offered a grim familiarity that seemed to echo the monotony of his post-military life. This was his first time back in town since leaving the service, and all he wanted was a quiet moment to himself. The dull hum of conversation around him blended with the crackle of an old jukebox, playing songs no one truly cared about. But the peace was short-lived. The door swung open with a clang, letting in a burst of cold air that carried with it an unsettling sense of intrusion. 6 men walked in, clad in leather jackets emblazoned with the logo of a biker gang that had haunted this town for years. The leader, a burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, spotted Ryan almost immediately. His eyes narrowed, and a wicked grin spread across his face. Ryan recognized him. Trevor Gates, an ex-Marine dishonorably discharged for reasons whispered in barracks but never spoken aloud. Gates and his men made their way to the bar with a swagger, the kind that screamed entitlement and dominance. Ryan tensed as Gates leaned on the counter, his voice carrying above the others. "Well, if it ain't the army boy," Gates sneered. "Back from playing hero?" Ryan didn't respond, focusing instead on his drink. But his silence only seemed to fuel the fire. "Hey, I'm talking to you, soldier. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Gates's tone dripped with mockery. The other bikers laughed, their voices a chorus of jeers and taunts. Ryan's hand tightened around his glass, his knuckles whitening. He wasn't here to pick a fight, but the weight of their stares and the venom in their words made it clear they weren't going to let him be. "You know," Gates continued, "it's funny. Guys like you come back all high and mighty, thinking you're better than us. But guess what? Out here, your medals mean jack." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling around his neck, chimed in, "Bet you're real proud of all those peacekeeping missions, huh? Killing kids in other countries, is that it?" The words hit like a sucker punch, and Ryan's composure began to crack. He turned to face them, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Walk away," he said, his voice low and steady. But Gates wasn't the kind to back down. He laughed, loud and cruel, before stepping closer. "Walk away," he echoed. "Boy, you don't give orders here. This ain't your battlefield. This is my town now." The bartender, sensing the brewing storm, tried to intervene. "Hey guys, let's keep it civil, all right? Take it outside if you have to." Gates ignored him, his focus entirely on Ryan. He leaned in, his breath reeking of stale beer and cigarettes. "I bet you think you're better than us because you wore that uniform. But let me tell you something, out here, you're nothing. Just another washed-up vet drowning in regrets." The room seemed to hold its breath as the tension escalated. One of the bikers picked up a pool cue, twirling it menacingly. Ryan weighed his options. He could walk away, but something in Gates's tone, something in the way the other patrons were watching, waiting for him to fold, made his blood boil. "You want to do this?" Ryan asked, his voice a dangerous calm. "Fine. But don't cry when it doesn't go your way." That was all it took. Gates swung first, a wild punch that Ryan ducked effortlessly. Years of combat training kicked in, and before Gates could react, Ryan delivered a calculated blow to his ribs, sending him stumbling back. The bar erupted into chaos as the bikers lunged at Ryan, chairs scraping and glasses shattering in the fray. Ryan moved like a predator, every strike precise and deliberate. But it wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. A reminder that no matter how much they tried to belittle him, he wasn't someone to be trifled with. The aftermath was a tableau of carnage. Gates lay crumpled on the floor, groaning in pain, while his men scrambled to pick themselves up. Ryan stood in the center, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the room. The other patrons stared in stunned silence, some with admiration, others with thinly veiled disdain. As Ryan turned to leave, Gates managed to croak out a final insult. "You think this makes you a man? You're just a killer in a shiny badge. You don't belong here and you never will." Ryan paused, his jaw tightening. But he didn't look back. He walked out into the cold night, the weight of Gates's words pressing down on him. Maybe Gates was right. Maybe he didn't belong here. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let anyone dictate his worth. And as the door swung shut behind him, Ryan knew this was just the beginning. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The air in the bar grew heavy, suffocating even. Ryan Carter stood alone, an island of tense composure amidst the jeering sea of leather-clad bikers. Hank Morgan, the leader, a man whose every gesture oozed contempt, leaned against the bar with a smirk plastered on his face. His scar, a jagged souvenir of countless brawls, caught the dim light, making him appear even more menacing. "You know what I hate about you military types?" Hank began, his voice loud and sharp, cutting through the murmur of the other patrons. "It's the way you all walk in here, chest puffed out, thinking you're God's gift to the world. Like wearing that uniform means you're untouchable." Ryan said nothing, his eyes fixed on Hank. The silence wasn't submission, it was calculation. He had faced far worse than a washed-up bully with a pack of sycophants. But the lack of reaction only seemed to embolden Hank. "You're no hero," Hank spat, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're just a hired killer. What's the body count, soldier? 20? Or is it 100? What were they? Women? Kids? People just defending their homes while you rolled in with your tanks and guns?" The bikers roared with laughter. Ryan's grip on his glass tightened, his knuckles white against the amber hue of the whiskey. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing down on him, their judgment palpable. "Cat got your tongue, hero?" Hank sneered, stepping closer. "Or maybe you've got nothing to say because you know I'm right?" Ryan inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He'd been trained to withstand pressure, to remain calm under fire. But this wasn't a battlefield, it was a spectacle, and Hank was determined to put on a show. The tension in the room grew thicker when Hank reached for Ryan's glass. He plucked it from his hand and raised it to his nose, sniffing mockingly before tossing the contents onto the floor. The amber liquid splattered against the grimy tiles, pooling near Ryan's boots. "Oops," Hank said, feigning innocence. "Guess I spilled it. Looks like you'll have to clean that up, soldier boy." A low rumble of laughter rippled through the room. Ryan stayed rooted in place, his expression unreadable. But Hank wasn't finished. "Or maybe you'd rather pick up a gun, huh? That's what you're good at, isn't it? Taking orders, pulling triggers, and leaving the mess for someone else to deal with?" Hank's voice dropped, his tone laced with venom. "Bet you're not so tough without your little war buddies backing you up." Ryan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You done?" Hank's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Oh, I'm just getting started," he growled. He grabbed Ryan's dog tags, yanking them hard enough to make the chain dig into his neck. The metal tags clinked together as Hank held them up, examining them like a predator inspecting its prey. "These mean something to you?" Hank asked, his voice mocking. "To me, they're just cheap trinkets. Symbols of a man too scared to make his own choices, too weak to stand on his own." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Hank, emboldened by the lack of retaliation, let the tags drop and pushed Ryan back against the bar. The shove wasn't hard, but it was enough to send a clear message. "Here's how this works," Hank said, leaning in so close Ryan could feel his breath. "You walk out of here now, with your tail between your legs, or I make sure you don't walk out at all." The room went silent. The bikers, the other patrons, even the bartender, everyone was frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Ryan straightened, his calm demeanor betraying no hint of the storm brewing inside him. "Last chance, hero," Hank said, his voice dripping with condescension. Ryan looked him dead in the eye and spoke with quiet authority. "I'm not going anywhere." That was the breaking point. Hank swung first. A wide, reckless punch meant more to humiliate than harm. But Ryan's training kicked in. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Hank's wrist and twisting it with precision. The larger man let out a howl of pain as Ryan shoved him back, sending him stumbling into a table. The bar erupted into chaos. Hank's men rushed forward, their faces twisted with anger, but Ryan was ready. Years of combat experience took over as he moved through them like a force of nature. Every punch, every block, every takedown was efficient, calculated, and devastating. But it wasn't just a fight, it was a reckoning. Ryan felt the weight of every insult, every humiliation, every moment of disrespect fueling his movements. When Hank finally got back on his feet and charged, Ryan met him head-on. He dodged the clumsy swing and delivered a crushing blow to Hank's midsection, followed by a sharp uppercut that sent him crashing to the floor. Hank lay there, groaning as Ryan stood over him, his chest heaving. The room was silent again, the only sound the heavy breathing of the defeated bikers sprawled across the floor. "You wanted to see who I really am," Ryan said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Now you know." He turned and walked out, leaving the bar in stunned silence. Behind him, Hank Morgan lay in the wreckage of his own arrogance, a stark reminder that some battles aren't fought with guns, but they still leave scars. The sound of heavy boots and shuffling echoed through the bar, a low rumble of tension building as Hank Morgan tried to push himself off the floor. His sneer faltered, the false bravado melting under the cold steel of Ryan's gaze. The humiliation of being bested so quickly, so publicly, burned in Hank's eyes. He wasn't done yet, but neither was Ryan. "Get him," Hank snarled, spitting out the words through gritted teeth. The bikers, all muscle and bravado, spread out like a pack of wolves circling their prey. Their glares were sharp, their postures aggressive, but Ryan didn't flinch. Years of discipline had taught him to stand firm, to never let fear show. His calm demeanor only seemed to stoke their anger. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh?" One of them jeered, a wiry man with a swastika tattoo peeking out from under his collar. "Bet you fought for people who don't even belong here." The slur hung in the air, a poisonous dart meant to provoke. Ryan could feel the heat rising in the room, the unspoken bigotry that fueled these men. But he didn't take the bait. His silence, his unyielding presence, was louder than any retort. "Enough talk," another one growled, a stocky man with fists like cinder blocks. He cracked his knuckles, stepping forward as if he was eager to prove something. Hank, still struggling to his feet, barked, "Pin him down. Let's see if this soldier can handle a real fight." The first one lunged, a sloppy attempt to grab Ryan by the shoulders. Ryan moved with the precision of a predator, sidestepping and twisting the man's arm behind his back in one seamless motion. With a sharp shove, he slammed him face-first onto the nearest table. The thud was deafening, the table groaning under the weight. The room erupted into chaos. Ryan didn't wait. He couldn't afford to. The next attacker was already closing in, swinging a pool cue like a club. Ryan ducked, the wooden stick whistling past his ear. Before the man could recover, Ryan drove his elbow into his gut, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He followed up with a swift knee to the chest, sending him crashing to the floor. But they kept coming. Another grabbed a bottle, shattering it against the counter before rushing at Ryan with the jagged remains. The gleam of broken glass caught Ryan's eye, but he didn't falter. He sidestepped the wild slash, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it hard. The bottle clattered to the floor, and Ryan finished him with a quick strike to the jaw. "Enough!" Hank bellowed, finally back on his feet. His voice was hoarse, his composure shredded. He charged like a bull, arms outstretched, aiming to tackle Ryan. But Ryan was faster. With a calculated move, Ryan caught Hank's arm and used his momentum against him. He spun, driving Hank forward and slamming him onto a nearby table. The wood creaked under the force as Ryan pinned Hank down, one arm twisted painfully behind his back. Hank let out a guttural scream, his earlier confidence replaced by raw panic. The room seemed to freeze for a moment, the bikers hesitating as they saw their leader immobilized so effortlessly. "You had enough?" Ryan asked, his voice low and steady, a calm in the storm. But Hank's pride wouldn't let him surrender. "Get him off me," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. That was all the bikers needed. They surged forward, a wall of fists and fury, determined to save face for their fallen leader. Ryan's mind raced as he calculated his odds. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't outmatched. The first biker reached him, swinging wildly. Ryan released Hank just in time to block the attack, his forearm meeting the other man's fist with a bone-jarring impact. He retaliated with a punch to the ribs, followed by an uppercut that sent the man staggering back into the crowd. Another came at him with a chair, swinging it overhead. Ryan ducked, the chair smashing into the table where Hank still lay sprawled, groaning. Ryan capitalized on the chaos, delivering a swift kick to the attacker's knee, dropping him to the floor with a howl of pain. Despite the chaos, Ryan's training kept him grounded. Every move was deliberate, every strike precise. But he could feel the exhaustion creeping in. These men weren't skilled fighters, but their sheer numbers and brute strength were wearing him down. A sharp pain exploded in his side as someone managed to land a punch. Ryan stumbled, the world tilting for a split second. He regained his footing just in time to dodge another attack, but the near miss rattled him. "You're nothing without your uniform," one of them spat, his voice thick with hatred. "You're just a dog they sent to do their dirty work." Ryan's vision sharpened, the words fueling a fire deep inside him. He fought harder, faster, his movements a blur of calculated violence. One by one, the bikers fell, their confidence crumbling alongside their leaders. When the last one hit the floor, the room fell silent once more. Ryan stood in the center, bloodied but unbowed, his chest heaving with exertion. The bikers lay scattered around him, groaning and clutching their injuries. Hank, still pinned under the table's edge, looked up at Ryan with wide, terrified eyes. The sneer was gone, replaced by something Ryan recognized all too well: fear. "You wanted to see if I could handle a real fight," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Now you know." Ryan turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of shattered egos and broken pride. He didn't need their approval, their validation. He'd already proven everything he needed to himself, and to anyone else who dared to question him. The wail of police sirens shattered the heavy silence, the blue and red lights flashing through the grimy windows of the bar like judgment descending. Ryan Carter stood in the center of the chaos, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw, but his expression was calm, a stark contrast to the broken bodies and bruised egos littering the floor around him. Hank Morgan, still slumped against the edge of the table, groaned as the realization of what was happening dawned on him. His men, defeated and humiliated, shuffled awkwardly, their tough guy personas dissolving under the fluorescent glare of the police cruisers outside. The door swung open, and two officers stepped in, their hands resting on their holstered weapons, taking in the scene with grim determination. "All right, what the hell is going on here?" barked the lead officer, a tall man with sharp features and a voice that carried authority. Hank, despite his injuries, tried to summon his usual bravado. "It's him," he shouted, pointing a shaky finger at Ryan. "This psycho just started attacking us out of nowhere. We're the victims here." The officer's eyes shifted to Ryan, who remained perfectly still, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady. He didn't flinch or stammer, didn't rush to explain himself. He simply stood there, letting the weight of the truth settle over the room like a storm cloud. "Is that so?" the officer said, turning to Ryan. "You have anything to say about this?" Ryan's voice was steady and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Check the security footage." The room seemed to hold its breath as those words sank in. The bartender, who had been nervously wiping down the counter, perked up at the mention of evidence. "I've got cameras," he said quickly, pointing to a corner where a discreet security setup was mounted. "They've been running all night?" Hank's face turned a sickly shade of pale. His men exchanged uneasy glances, the cracks in their story widening by the second. "No need for that," Hank stammered. It's not necessary. We can just forget the whole thing." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Funny how the guy calling for help suddenly doesn't want us to check the tapes. But we'll take a look anyway." As the bartender fumbled with the system, Hank's facade of confidence crumbled. Ryan remained silent, his expression unreadable, but the faintest hint of satisfaction flickered in his eyes. He'd seen this before, bullies cowering when their lies caught up with them. Minutes later, the footage was playing on a small monitor behind the bar. The grainy black and white video showed everything: the biker's entrance, Hank's provocations, the mocking insults, and finally, the first punch Hank threw. The officers watched in silence, their expressions growing darker with each passing second. "So," the lead officer said, turning back to Hank, "you and your buddies here decided to harass this guy, destroy property, and start a brawl. And now you want us to believe he's the aggressor?" Hank opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The weight of the evidence crushed any pathetic excuse he might have conjured. His men shifted uncomfortably, their bravado replaced by embarrassment and fear. The officer stepped closer to Ryan, his tone noticeably softer. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" Ryan nodded. "Yes, sir. Army. Served 3 tours overseas." The officer gave a small nod of respect. "Thought so. Mind if I ask what brought this on?" Ryan shrugged, his voice calm and even. "I came in for a quiet drink. They decided to make it personal." The officer turned back to Hank, his gaze hard as steel. "You and your friends are looking at charges for assault, destruction of property, and disturbing the peace. I'd start thinking about how you're going to explain this to a judge." One of the bikers, the wiry man with the swastika tattoo, muttered something under his breath, but the officer wasn't having it. "Save it," he snapped. "I've had enough of your kind blaming everyone else for your own stupidity." Ryan watched as the officers began rounding up the bikers, their protests growing weaker with each passing moment. One of them tried to claim they were defending themselves, but the footage, and their lack of injuries compared to Ryan's clean strikes, made their lies laughable. As the officers cuffed Hank, his humiliation reached its peak. "This isn't over," he spat, glaring at Ryan with all the venom he could muster. Ryan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "It is for you. Maybe next time you'll think twice before picking a fight with someone you don't understand." The officers led Hank and his crew out into the cold night, their shouts fading into the distance. The bar was quiet again, the tension evaporating like smoke. The bartender offered Ryan a stiff drink on the house, but he declined. He'd had enough of this place, enough of the reminders of a world that couldn't let him live in peace. As Ryan stepped outside, the night air was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the bar. He glanced back once, seeing the faint glow of the police lights down the street. Justice had been served, but it wasn't about vengeance, it was about proving the truth. Ryan Carter walked away, his shoulders square, his steps steady. He didn't need a uniform to know who he was. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had nothing to prove. The knock on the door was sharp, almost hesitant, cutting through the early evening stillness. Ryan Carter, seated at his modest dining table with a cup of black coffee in hand, looked up, his instincts on high alert. After the chaos at the bar, he had been half expecting some form of retaliation, a shattered window, a slashed tire, or worse. Rising slowly, he made his way to the door, muscles tensed, ready for anything. Through the peephole, he saw a man standing alone, shifting nervously on the porch. It was Bill Watson, one of Hank Morgan's bikers. His face, now devoid of the smirking arrogance Ryan remembered, bore a sheepish expression. His leather jacket looked worn and dirty, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets, as though he were trying to disappear into himself. Ryan opened the door cautiously, his broad frame filling the doorway. He didn't say a word, letting the silence hang heavy between them, waiting for Bill to make the first move. "Hey," Bill began, his voice gravelly but quiet. He avoided Ryan's gaze, staring instead at a spot just beyond his shoulder. I just wanted to talk. If you'll let me." Ryan's eyes narrowed. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You've got 30 seconds, he said flatly. Bill nodded quickly, as though grateful even for that much. "Look, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, but I needed to say I'm sorry. For everything. The bar, the fight, the crap we said to you." He glanced up briefly, his eyes betraying genuine shame. "It was wrong." Ryan studied him carefully, searching for any hint of deceit or ulterior motive. But Bill's posture was slouched, his expression weary. He didn't look like a man here to start trouble. He looked like a man burdened by guilt. "Why are you here, Bill?" Ryan asked, his tone steady but unyielding. "What do you want?" Bill let out a heavy sigh, pulling his hands from his pockets and rubbing the back of his neck. I guess I'm here because that night messed me up," he admitted. "I've been thinking a lot about the things we said to you. About the way we treated you. And it hit me. You didn't deserve any of it. Hell, I don't even know why I said half the things I did." Ryan didn't respond immediately. He let the words sink in, the tension between them stretching like a taut wire. Bill shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, his shoulders hunching further. I spent my whole life hating people like you, Bill continued, his voice quieter now. Military guys. My old man used to tell me how you were all nothing but killers, tools for the system, or whatever crap he believed. And I guess I just inherited that. Never questioned it. Never even stopped to think that maybe I was the one in the wrong. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He could hear the sincerity in Bill's voice, the rawness of a man grappling with his own demons. When you pinned Hank to that table, Bill said, his eyes finally meeting Ryan's, it wasn't just a beating. It was like you were holding up a damn mirror, showing us what we really are. A bunch of angry, bitter losers blaming everyone else for our problems. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Ryan's stance relaxed slightly, but his expression remained guarded. And what do you want me to do with that, Bill? Forgive you? Pretend it didn't happen? No, Bill said quickly, shaking his head. I don't expect you to forgive me. Hell, I don't deserve it. I wanted to own up to it. To tell you that I'm done with that life. With Hank. With all of it. Ryan raised an eyebrow. You're walking away from them? Bill nodded. Yeah. That night was a wake-up call. I realized I've been following a man who's full of hate because it made me feel like I wasn't alone. But all it's done is drag me down. For the first time, Ryan's hardened expression softened, just slightly. He recognized the struggle in Bill's voice, the struggle to break free from a toxic cycle, to confront the ugliness within oneself. It wasn't an easy road, and it took a rare kind of strength to even take the first step. After a long pause, Ryan stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. Bill blinked, surprised, but he didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, his movements cautious, as though afraid to overstep. Ryan motioned toward the dining table, and Bill sat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. You're serious about leaving that life behind? Ryan asked, sitting across from him. Bill nodded. Dead serious. I know it won't be easy, but I've got to start somewhere. And I figured the least I could do was start by apologizing to you. Ryan leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. It's a good start, he said finally. But words are just that, words. What matters is what you do next. Bill nodded again, his expression resolute. I know. And I'm ready to prove it. As they sat in silence, the tension in the room began to ease. For the first time in days, Ryan felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, change was possible. It didn't erase the past, but it was a step toward a better future. And sometimes, one step was all it took.